Had Mexican food until you've had it in Mexico. I've gone to Mexico on mission trip around 6 times now throughout my life. And most of the time we would bring a people, we'd go with a large group, and so we would have well over 100 people that we would go and build homes for people. Most of the times we would serve these families who are in these just completely dire situations. I mean, sewage is running down the street. A family of 10 is living in this tiny room with a distant relative. And their security protocol was usually having a dog and then broken beer bottles lining cinder blocks that kind of wrapped around their house. Well, one of the great perks when you get to build a home for somebody, this wasn't always the case, but very often, is that the family would cook you an authentic Mexican dish. And it was awesome. And usually, I mean, it's so good that if they were to come to here and sell their food, they would put out all of the Mexican restaurants. I mean, that is how good they are. Well, one year we went down to Mexico with a group of around 100 or so people. But they weren't the only ones who joined us. We had a really terrible stomach bug that joined the caravan. And it was day 2 for me on this site. The concrete slab had been laid, and we were now building the frames for the wall. And I started feeling a little woozy on the inside, if you know what I mean. And so I tucked around behind the van, and I began to shower the deteriorating sidewalk with my insides, kind of like a mommy bird feeding its chicks. I know, TMI. And after I could finally stand up with some confidence, I told my advisor that I was feeling sick, and so they made me stay in the van with the AC running. Meanwhile, the family was making arrangements to make this unbelievable mole dish. And as the youth pastor on this trip, I made sure before we left on this Mexico mission trip that our students understood 2 super important things. The first is that if a family decides to cook you something, whatever it is, you eat it. Doesn't matter what it is, you eat their food, because they went through great financial strain and sacrifice to make sure that they could give you this food. The other things that I would prep our group on was, don't pig out. Don't pig out, right? Don't eat like you are eating like this is your home. Why? Because the family you're serving, they would have happily not eaten a single bite from that food if we kept on eating it. Because they didn't want to disrespect or dishonor their guests. So, don't pig out. So the people who are hosting us, they could actually eat. On this day, I literally could not eat the food because of the stomach bug that was living inside of me. It was either insult the family by not eating their food or insult them by throwing it up. And so thankfully they were understanding and they understood the effects of this, but it sure put me in a hard spot. It was hard because I never wanted to make this family feel like they're trying to serve us and that I'm just throwing it right back in their face, that I'm unappreciative and ungrateful. It was also a bummer because I mean it was mole and it smelled awesome and I had to resist it. And so here's why I tell you this story. Because in our passage today, Paul is talking about eating meat that has been prepared from a city market. In the context of this meal, it would be similar to the situation. To somebody who went to great lengths to prepare a meal. Not to eat it would have been very, very, very insulting in the first century. In fact, it had this potential. If you resisted to eat this food, it would have built a wall between you and this person, between Christians and non-Christians. And the result would have just completely shut up the gospel from being able to be preached. And so Paul, as the sort of gospel kind of coach, he's coaching them along about what they should do in this situation where a non-Christian, a non-follower of Jesus is inviting them over for a meal. And it's likely that this meat, it was offered the night before at an idol. And so Paul strongly, he came out and he told Christians that if they eat, if you remember the chapters before, if they eat the temple food, they would really be inviting God's judgment onto themselves. But what about if it's at somebody's house and somebody invites you over and they use that meat? Is that okay? They weren't sure what to do, and they weren't even sure where this meat came from. And it's at this point, if you're following Paul's argument, you would be thinking, well, I don't want to risk worshiping their idols and then invite God's judgment. At the same time, I don't want to disrespect the families if they invite us over to eat and then come across incredibly rude. What in the world do I do? The issue prevented me that day from eating the mole. It was the stomach bug. That was my issue. In Corinth, they don't have a stomach bug. They got a different kind of bug in them. It's not a virus in the body, it's a virus of the heart. And arguably, this is a more damaging bug. It's called legalism. They have the legalist bug living inside of them. And legalism is in essence obeying the letter of the law, this rigid obedience to the letter of the law, while violating the spirit of the law. Now, how does one do that? Well, let's suppose that some person is this sort of speed limit legalist. Okay, so the speed limit legalist, if the speed limit says 30, they go 30. If the speed limit says 70, they go 70. Not a little bit under, not a little bit over. They are going the exact speed limit. But let's suppose it's really bad weather. Let's say snow is covering the ground. They drive the speed limit, all right? Because they are a speed limit legalist. They would be somebody who has this rigid obedience to the letter of the law at the expense or violating the spirit of the law. Right? What is the spirit of the law for driving? For these driving speed limits. It's people's safety, right? Which they are clearly violating what the heart of this is completely. In a similar way, to having this sort of hyper-obedience to all of these laws for the sake of being obedient at the expense of loving our neighbor. That is what they're doing when it comes to them being a legalist. And so the way this works out in our lives is we tend to not do things, we tend to not go places, we tend to not be around certain kinds of people for fear that it may make us look less spiritual, or it may cause us to compromise on some of our own rules. And most of the time, those rules are not necessarily rooted in Scripture. They're rules that we've made up. And there's this great danger that many of us could have this bug living inside of us, this legalistic bug, right? The thing that makes legalism bug so dangerous is that it actually prevents us from being around the people who need Jesus and thus hearing about Jesus in the name of being, a Bible-obeying Christian. And so the legalism bug, it infects us, it creates these safe distances from certain people, and eventually it begins to build this wall of separation between Christians and non-Christians. And so Paul writes this teaching to Christians who are they're on the brink of cutting off the ties, not just from their former lives, which is a good thing, but their former friends, from their non-Christian neighbors. And this is a bad thing. This is not a good thing. And this passage is relevant for us today because it's a reminder that sometimes being religious can actually get in the way of following Jesus faithfully. And so if you have your Bibles and you want to follow along, we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, starting in verse 23. 1 Corinthians 10, starting in verse 23. It says this. It says, I have the right to do anything, you say, and Paul's quoting them, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. It is often assumed, wrongly so, that Paul is talking about things that are beneficial for us individually, right? But actually, Paul is not talking about what is beneficial to us at an individual level. He's talking about what is beneficial for somebody else. That's why he continues in verse 24 and says this. He says, no one should seek their own good, but the good of others. So what is it that Paul is specifically thinking about as being beneficial or not beneficial at all? Eating food. Eating food. Here's what he says, verse 25. Eat anything sold in the meat market without raising question of conscience. For the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Paul is Jewish. He was trained under one of the most respected rabbis of his day. And he called himself a Pharisee of Pharisees. In essence, Paul's a pro at this whole rule-following thing. And he was really, really good at that. Paul, more than anybody else, he knows that the Jewish people, they had laws. They had a lot of laws surrounding what you could and what you could not eat. The dietary laws for the Jewish people, it was a huge deal. And anything that could possibly be connected to an idol, it was just a big no-no. You just did not go in that direction. And in fact, Paul even says this right before our passage today, that eating the meat in these idol temples, it is just a no-go. You are invoking God's jealousy and potentially His wrath. The Jewish people, they made such a big deal about where meat came from that they would oftentimes at these meat markets investigate where was this meat butchered at, because they wanted to know, did this meat come from a temple? In fact, just to be safe, they usually completely avoided the meat markets so as to not even get close to getting this kind of meat. And Paul interestingly tells Christians, I want you to throw away this kind of evaluation. Throw it away. Get rid of this mindset. Don't even ask, where did this meat come from, which they would have been accustomed to asking. Consider it okay. This is part of God's good creation. Eat it. This is a radical break with Paul's contemporaries, and it would have been a big, big problem. They would have had a really big problem with Paul. But it comes right from Jesus, right? This is Jesus' teaching. Jesus nullifies all of the food laws. And here's one clear teaching on this. Mark chapter 7. Jesus says this. He says, don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach. But then out of the body. In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. Free game now. Now, an important question that we should ask is this. Why does that matter? Why does that matter? Well, the reason this is a big deal is because the food that you ate was one of the key ways that the Jewish believers distinguished themselves from the people they were around. And so, in actuality, Paul's teaching about food has very little to do about food. And it has everything to do about friendship. And specifically building relationships with those who do not believe in Jesus, with non-believing people who are not Jewish in their ethnicity. And that's what Peter's vision of the unclean animals and Cornelius' house is all about, right? Food was the minor issue in that story. Seeing people as clean versus unclean, that was the issue that God was driving at. Food just happened to be one of those barriers that divided people. And what Jesus declares, what Paul affirms is this, that the most basic dividing point between people, it has been removed. It's been removed. So that there can be a real connection that takes place between Christians and non-Christians, between followers of Jesus and those who do not follow Jesus. Why is that important? Because that allows Christians in the first century who are trying to reach the world, who are trying to share Jesus with as many people as possible. It now opens the door for them to have an opportunity to share the gospel with their non-Jesus following neighbors while eating a bacon-wrapped filet mignon. It doesn't get better. Here's what he says next, verse 27. He says, if an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go, and notice what Paul's doing here, what he's hinting at, what the real matter is. It's their desire. Corinth, are you choosing rules over relationships? Where, O Corinth, is your greater desire for eating and not eating? Where is that actually rooted at? And Paul says, let's just assume that your heart's in the right place and you desire to eat with them. He says, then eat whatever is put before you without raising question of conscience. Why shouldn't they ask, though? Why shouldn't they ask? Because it would have put up this artificial barrier between them, right? And it would have possibly led the Christians to feel like they are compromising on their conscience by eating food from a sacrifice. Verse 28. He says, but if somebody says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, right? Both for the sake of the one who told you and for the sake of conscience. Gentiles are well aware of how the Jewish people lived in their day. They knew what they ate and what they did not eat. And Christianity from the outside was not distinguishably different from the Jews of their day, except for the fact that they worshiped Jesus as God, and they included the Gentiles into their fold. They were a part of their family. The pagan neighbors, they might sincerely not want to do something. If they're inviting them over as a host, they may not want to do anything that's going to make them feel out of place, odd, or even compromise on their convictions. And so they may just tell them where this meat comes from so they don't put any sort of barrier there. So he might say something, and so he says this, verse 29. He says, I am referring to the other person's conscience, not yours. For why is my freedom being judged by another's conscience? If I take part in the meal with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of something I thank God for? It makes sense. The issue here, though, is not what you believe, it is how you are perceived. That's the issue. It's not what the Christians believe, it is how they are being perceived. And so if the Christians get a heads up by them saying, hey, by the way, that steak last night, it was offered in worship to this God. And the Christians were to go, hey, no big deal. We can eat it. And then they eat it. What is their non-believing neighbor going to think at that point? Can I tell you what they're not going to think? They're not going to look at that and go, hey, they must be free to eat whatever they want because Jesus went to the cross for their sin and He rose from the dead and he forgave all of their sin and He opened a door for them to eat whatever they want, right? They're not going to think that. What they're likely going to think is they're going to perceive those actions as saying, you can worship whatever you want. Worship whatever you want. Worship the God at this temple or that temple or Jesus if you want. And at that point, what is even the point of sharing Jesus with them, right? It's not going to mean anything. It's not going to do anything because Jesus is put on a pedestal with all of these other gods, and they're going to think, man, there's a smorgasbord of gods that we can choose to worship, Jesus being one of them. So he continues in verse 31. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, Greeks, or the church of God. Paul gives two commands here, and they're really important to everything he has just said. Our lives, Paul says, they need to be lived in two directions. They need to be lived in two directions. What are those two directions? Here they are. Toward God and for people. Toward God and for people. We are always doing things for the purpose of giving God glory, whatever we're doing. And second, we do things in such a way not to cause people to stumble away from God. And there's a couple important things to know about what Paul is saying here. First, the commands that he mentions, both of them, are not this sort of kind of one and done type of thing that you do it once and you can move on. It's this continuous action. You continue to do this. Continue to live your life in these directions. So what is the direction that we live? First is toward God. Paul says everything you do, which is about as broad as you can humanly make this, anything you do, whatever can possibly done, we need to make sure that we see this as an opportunity to give God glory. There's a Christian monk who went by, who was called, Brother Lawrence. He talked about how the most mundane things in life, the most mundane duties, things like washing the dishes, were some of the richest moments where you can be in God's presence. where you can worship God. And the key was not what you did, it was the motive that you had when you did it. He thought that it was a shame that so many people, they only thought that certain religious actions were actually worshipful, and the rest of them were just kind of these mundane things that had nothing to do with worshiping God. And here's what he said. He said that our sanctification, that is God making us more into the image of Jesus, making us more holy, he says it does not depend as much on changing our activities, that we do all of these extra super spiritual things, but he says, as it does on doing them for God rather than ourselves. That's the change in what giving God glory in all things, that we are doing it for the sake of giving God glory, not ourselves. In other words, he says, what a bummer it would be if Christians don't see mowing their lawn, cooking their dinner, washing their dishes, brushing their hair, brushing their teeth, going on a walk as an opportunity to worship God. What a shame if we miss to find ways to give God glory in the mundane things of life. And Brother Lawrence and the Apostle Paul, they are exactly on the same page. Whatever you do, let it be motivated as giving God glory. And if there are things in our life where we look at these actions, we look at these parts of our life and we go, I cannot give God glory in it, those things probably need to go, right? I mean, those things probably need to be pitched out of our life, or they need to be repurposed so that we can give God glory in those things. So the first direction is toward God. The second direction is for people. For people, what do I mean? Paul says that depending on your translation, he says not to cause anyone to stumble or cause anybody offense. And here's what that does not mean. Paul does not mean don't hurt people's feelings, okay? That's not what Paul means here. Paul is saying little to nothing about our own feelers. What he is certainly saying is that we should not do things that are going to push people further from God, that we shouldn't do things that way. So if I could, put a positive spin on this, Paul says, do things that are going to help people take one step closer to God rather than one step further away from God. Now here's what's interesting and I think super convicting. Who is Paul concerned about being pushed away from God? Christian or non-Christian? It's a trick question. Both. Look at what he says, verse 32. He says, do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, meaning non-Jesus following Jews, Greeks, meaning non-believers who are ethnically not Jewish, or the church of God, meaning us, Christians. Any and every person in our life, we are called to live in such a way, interact in such a way, speak in such a way that we are helping them, we are trying to help them all take one step closer to God, one step in God's direction, if you will. The reason I think this is convicting is because, for the most part, this is easy to do when you are around somebody who you like and who thinks like us. But when it comes to somebody who is unlike you and thinks nothing like you and maybe doesn't even like you, it is a lot easier to stand up for what we believe in at the expense of thinking how we can help them draw a little bit closer to God, take one step closer to God, regardless of who it is. Sometimes we can have such a strong conviction about something that when we run across somebody who has a differing opinion than ours, we can feel more inclined to take the role of a defense attorney rather than Christ's ambassador of love. And our convictions can cause Christians and non-Christians to move further away from God. And when that happens, we are doing what Paul tells us do not do. Being a cause of stumbling. Today we are wrapping up our series on Christianity at the Crossroads. Next week we're going to start a brand new series called Good News for Bad Christians. Good News for Bad Christians, looking at chapter 11 all the way through chapter 14. Good News for Bad Christians. So that's what's up ahead. But the essence of this series that we're in, Christianity at the Crossroads, is that when you find yourself at a place where technically speaking, there's nothing wrong about what you're doing, and honestly, Scripture isn't really speaking to this issue. It's kind of silent on the subject. What do you do? What do you do in those circumstances? Here in Corinth, this is their crossroad. Eating meat. Eating meat. Some thought that the eating meat at the temple, that this was a gray area, and Paul goes, nope, it's a black and white issue. Do not do it. It's wrong. But apparently, what about if somebody invites you over to their home and they want to eat a meal with you, and that meal may have come from the temple? Is that wrong? Apparently, this is a gray area for them. What ought they to do? And Paul gives us great directions. All things in life, they are our opportunity to worship God. Everything that we do can be worship to God. And every human interaction that we have is to be lived as our opportunity to help each person take one step closer to God, regardless of who they are. We are helping them. We are, if you will, shepherding them toward God. And so in light of that, what does a Christian at the crossroads do? Here's how Paul closes this out in verse 33. He says, even as I try to please everyone in every way. Okay, first, Paul's not saying that we need to be people pleasers like he is. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is that he lives in such a way that when he is interacting with people, he is building respect with them. He is building a reputation of friendship with another person, regardless of their background, regardless of if they're Jewish or they have no idea about what the law says. And why does he do that? He says this, for I am not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. That's Paul's focus, salvation. Paul's motive is to build bridges with people so that he can share Jesus with them. In other words, when Paul is invited over for dinner by his pagan neighbor, they feel like Paul is for them. They feel like Paul gets them. They feel like Paul understands. They feel like Paul is a friend. And get this, Paul, when he shows up, he doesn't leave Jesus at the back door. Paul doesn't, in order to gain this friendship, in order to feel relevant, Paul brings Jesus into this meal and he shares Jesus with them. Now, this is not just this sort of nice lesson on how Paul lives. No, actually, Paul's thought continues one more verse. And it's honestly, it is a shame that we have a chapter division right here in our Bible between chapter 10 and chapter 11. Virtually every Bible scholar agrees this is an unnecessary break in Paul's thought process. Because here's what Paul says. Here's how Paul truly does wrap things up. 1 Corinthians 11:1. All of what Paul said, he sums it up like this. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. Paul is thinking, look, my life is supposed to look like Christ. And I'm supposed to take serious the part where Jesus says, follow me. And so Paul tries to his best ability to align his life to look like Jesus' life. And he says, look, if you want to know what does it look like to follow Jesus in a non-Christian world, in a secular context, Paul says, follow me. Live like I'm living. This is how you do it. And so what can we learn from what Paul does, from how Paul lives? Let me give you two quick thoughts. First, overcommit yourself to Jesus and undercommit yourself to legalism. Overcommit to Jesus and undercommit to legalism. When you factor in Paul's background in his serious devotion that the Jews had to dietary laws, you realize that Paul was more committed to Jesus than he was his cultural upbringing. This would have caused tension at home, okay? Do you understand? Like this would have been so uncomfortable for him personally. He would have walked into the room and it would have gave him chills. But he was more committed to the mission of Jesus than anything else. It was very easy for Christians and Jews to slip into this sort of subtle legalism where they let food separate and divide them. But Paul says these are non-essential issues, and they do not need to become the barrier between people. If what is being perceived from us creates this inability, right, to develop a friendship with somebody who does not love Jesus, if what is perceived from somebody else is that we don't want to build a friendship or some kind of relationship, maybe because of what somebody believes or the sin in their life, or maybe even their lifestyles, it is likely because there is this undercommitment to Jesus and overcommitment to legalism. I love the mantra that says this: in essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; in all things, love. The essential thing is Jesus and His gospel. That's what's essential. And we should be so committed to Jesus and His mission that we would be willing to set aside differing opinions so that we can reach those who are far from Christ for Christ. The second thing we see with Paul is that he found a common way to build bridges with people. Things like eating a meal. So for us, here's how we should be toward people who don't follow Jesus. Here's the second thing that we should be that Paul teaches us: to be relational, approachable, and available to others. Be relational, approachable, and available. In a nutshell, here's what we see with Paul. He prioritizes meeting people where they were at, in their homes. For Paul, evangelism, that is, sharing the good news of what Jesus did on the cross and resurrection from the grave, sharing Jesus with others, he thought that was done best within the context of a friendship. And when somebody doesn't know us, they probably won't trust us either. And so Paul, he tries his best effort to befriend those that he wanted to share Jesus with. Before they became a spiritual family, they felt like they were part of the family. That was Paul's goal. But get this. Get this. They, not the Christians, were the ones who were inviting the Christians over for a meal. Let me read this passage again, verse 27. I think it's so profound. He says, if an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go. To me, I am stunned by this. Paul assumes that the Christians, they would have the reputation and the relational capital with other people, that these other people would invite them over for a meal. The only way that this could actually happen is that if the Christians in Corinth, they were approachable and they had the time, the availability to do that. The citizens in Corinth, they may have thought, and they likely thought, the Christians were bonkers. They were nuts. They were out of their mind. But there was something about them that made them want to have them as a friend. I may not believe that, you believe this guy rose from the dead and you have all of these kind of strange things with, eating food and whatnot, but you're just a really good person to have around in my life, and I want to invite you over for dinner. I heard somebody say this week something to the effect that we should live in such a way that we cause other people to disbelieve their disbeliefs. That we should live, there should be something uniquely different about our lives, that how we live, it causes other people to disbelieve their disbeliefs. That our lives are lived in such a way that it raises questions. But also we find Christians to be the most approachable and available people. The kind of people who you just want to have over for dinner. That's just good fellowship, good conversation. But it all comes back to one thing. Desire, right? Our desire. Is that something we actually want? I mean, that's why Paul says, look, if an unbeliever invites you over to a meal and you want to go, implying that maybe there could be a greater desire at play. Maybe there's some other underlying desire that's going on in Corinth that keeps a separation to build a wall rather than a bridge. Because let's face it, things get messy. There is nothing easy There is nothing simple about what happens if you accept somebody else's invitation for dinner. Even the most normal people in the world, you have no idea what you're getting yourself into. When I was not a Christian, when I was an atheist, if you invited me over to dinner, I'm sure I asked a lot of questions that made other people feel a little awkward, right? Some people may be the craziest people on planet Earth. You might be the craziest people on planet Earth, and they don't know what they're getting if they invite you over. But I tell you one thing. A heart that is bothered by the people in the world and thus does not desire to do whatever they can to build a bridge is not bugged by that person, but it is a bug living in them. It is something in the human heart that causes that discomfort. And the antidote to that is not by controlling what we do. It's not by controlling what somebody else does or how somebody else lives, but it is remembering what Jesus did for all of us. We were the unworthy. We were the undeserving. We were the outsiders on the outskirts. We were the traitorers, the meddlers, the opposers, the oppressors, the disbelievers, the nonconformists and it is only until Jesus invited us over. It is only until Jesus invited us in. We were the ones who, we received grace in our time of need. And Jesus says, on the other side of eternity, when we look around and we see this big banquet taking place, we will realize that those sitting around us were the unfit and the undeserving. They were invited to dine with God in the kingdom of heaven. Here's what Jesus says, Matthew 8. He says, I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their place at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. I love how John put it in 1 John 4:19. He says, we love because He first loved us. And when we take into account the way that God showed His love toward us, we feel not just the importance of doing for others what has been done for us, but we find this essential change that takes place in our own desires. We find this godlike desire in us. We desire to see people come to Jesus, not to make a society better, but to grow a bigger family. If I could rephrase what Paul says in the form of a question as we kind of close out today's sermon, it would be this. Would an unbeliever desire to invite us over for dinner? Would we have the relationship, would we have the friendship for them to even invite us over for dinner? And if we did, and if they would you want to go? No matter how uncomfortable it was, no matter what was brought up, no matter what was discussed, would you want to go? For Paul, it all comes back to that, the heart's desire. I'd like to invite the team to come forward as we prepare for communion.